It said children should laugh but not cry, but she hides her pain behind silent eyes. A bruise can fade, a cut may heal, but the scars within are far more real. Good day, listeners and viewers. Welcome to our panel discussion entitled Silent Scars Unmasking the Emotional, Behavioral, and Social Impact of Child Abuse in Trinidad and Tobago. I am Dr. Calim Francois, University Professor, and your host for today's discussion. I will also contribute to the research discussion today. In our midst, we have Dr. Kimmoya McLean-McPherson, Head of Clinical Psychology at the University of the West Indies. We also have Dr. Shikeira Russell, Director of the Child and Adolescent Research at the Caribbean Institute for Mental Health, and Dr. Lafiesha Bobb, Senior Research Fellow in Gender Studies at the Institute for Social and Economic Research. Together, we will explore one of the most urgent and sensitive issues currently affecting our young boys and girls today, child abuse. Our critical analysis will explore key themes such as emotional and mental health, behavioral outcomes of abuse, impact on interpersonal relationships, and parental trauma and child psychological health, as well as it will examine how different methodological approaches contribute to our understanding of this complex issue. Dr. Kimmoya, let's start with you. Let's begin with an overview of your findings from the Johnson and Warm Child study.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Johnson and Charles, conducted a qualitative case study in 2016 titled Case Study of Child Abuse and Neglect in Trinidad, exploring the psychological effects, of child abuse in that area, focusing only on one teenage girl who was really sexually abused and she had to drop out of school. Now, this study revealed major problems in the child protective system and even showed how, but with all of that's happening, it showed how cognitive behavioral therapy really helped her work through, whatever problem she was facing, whether she had self-blame or low self-esteem. That type of therapy really helped her. Now, the study highlighted how cultural stigma stopped abuse victims from really speaking out, especially where family reputation, and all of that gender roles really plays a big role.
Thank you, Doc. Now, Dr. Shikeira, I move to you. What did your study reveal about co-occurring abuse patterns?
Yes, the article I covered, it's never one type, the co-occurrence of child abuse and neglect among children living in the community residences in Trinidad by Descartes et al. 2019. Is a quantitative study that actually looks at how different types of abuse affect children living in residential care in Trinidad and Tobago. So ultimately, it focuses on how co-occurring forms of abuse impact emotional, behavioral, and social well-being. The study actually found that girls experience much higher levels of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse compared to boys. And that the more types of abuse a child experienced, the more severe the impact. Now, with data from 101 children aged 7 to 18, the study highlights the need for child welfare systems to recognize and respond to multi-type abuse and not just individual forms in order to create better support and intervention strategies.
Dr. Lafiesha, you also did a qualitative research paradigm. How does your research contribute to your understanding of long-term impacts?
Yes, Dr. Cunning. Now, the impact of childhood sexual abuse on interpersonal relationships by Bernadette Masson examine adult interpersonal relationships, interpersonal difficulties, right? Now, this study particularly used standardized instruments to compare 103 adult women who had histories of childhood sexual abuse. Now, this study found that these women who had history of childhood sexual abuse, those were the ones who basically had interpersonal difficulties in their adult stage.
Thank you.
Now, the findings also reveal that these women were, when these women were children, they were abused by family members.
Okay. And finally, my study examined a mixed methods doctoral dissertation titled The Effect of Parental Trauma on Child Wellbeing in Trinidad and Tobago by Dr. Gianna Christine Motley in 2023. The study is a mixed methods dissertation on parental trauma effect on child well-being. The research investigated how parental trauma, and particularly intimate partner violence, IPV, influences children's emotional and behavioral development through semantic review, quantitative surveys, and qualitative focus group, highlighting intergenerational trauma transmission, right? Now, before we delve into our thematic analysis, Dr. Kimmoya, you've written books, you've done it all, you're very experienced in this field, right? Do you wish to examine the methodological approaches and how research in this field has developed over time?
Yes, doctor. So research on the psychological impact of child abuse in Trinidad and Tobago has really developed over time. And so it moved from one single case study to really a broader community-based, approach. And 4 key studies help to illustrate how our understanding has really evolved over time. We have Johnson and Charles that we mentioned earlier, which share a case study of a girl who was, faced sexual abuse and left school and all of that. Now, she shows signs of shame, isolation, self-blame, but through therapy, especially CBT, it really helped her to heal, she became more confident and, for the better, she became better. But it's just one case, so the result can't be widely used or can't be widely applied. We have Descartes now, he studied over 100 children in community homes and really found that 95% faced at least one form of abuse, with many experiencing multiple types. Girls were even more likely to report emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, really highlighting how widespread, and complex abuse is in residential care. Marcin, our next one, who studied women abuse as children and how it affected their adult relationships. And many of them, had trust issues and had emotional closeness, especially if their abuser was a member of the family. And she noted that cultural norms and silence around cause abuse, that, around abuse made things worse. Motley, he took it a step further by looking at how parents' own trauma can affect their children's mental health. And her finding was, it showed that children of mothers who dealt with, anxiety and depression linked to past abuse that they had were more likely to have emotional and even behavioral problems themselves. So this showed how the effect of abuse don't just, impact the abuser, but it can be passed on through families. But Dr. all 4 studies share key ideas. One is that the abuse often happens in many forms over time, causing deeper harm. Another is that girls are more often victims, unfortunately, while boys, stay silent, due to masculinity or other stuff. This study also points to factors that affect recovery, like negative thinking or parents' mental health, the lack of support. All those things really were shown. And what's particularly compelling is how these different research methods, qualitative depth, quantitative pattern, and mixed method approach all point to the same conclusion, strengthening our confidence in these findings.
Yes, Doc. Now, let's look at the limitations, Dr. Kimmoya.
Yeah, man. Well, they all had their limitations. For Johnson, they only looked at one case. So, it can't be applied to everybody's situation. Descartes, he depended on, children's self-report, which might not always be reliable. And Marcin's study can't prove cause and effect, since it was cross-sectional. And even Motley, it used national data that limited what she could explore. And really more broadly, there are no long-term studies that track, these children over time. Boys' experiences are often overlooked, and self-reports and one-time studies limit how much we can really trust the findings, on or what causes what. But we need research also that includes, trauma awareness, gender-sensitive care, and all those things, even focusing on male survivors as well.
Right.
Yes, but even with these limitations, doctor, the message is clear, child abuse in Trinidad and Tobago has deep lasting effect on mental health.
It's right here. Perfectly examined, Doctor. Now, let's move on to the critical thematic analysis, right? Dr. Shikeira kindly examining the first 2 sub-themes that we explored during the 4 articles that we examined.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, in Trinidad and Tobago, we do see that child abuse creates a harmful cycle where emotional trauma leads to behavioral issues like aggression or withdrawal, which then creates even more emotional distress for the child. So if we start with the emotional damage our local research discovered, Johnson and Wormchild studied child abuse survivors in Trinidad, and what they found is that severe emotional trauma and psychological problems tend to pop up in these children. Their case study of a 15-year-old showed emotional withdrawal, anxiety, and deep psychological damage that affected her mental health. But what's also troubling is that Descartes and colleagues found that girls in residential care suffered much higher rates of emotional abuse than boys, with mean scores of 14.85 versus 9.91, showing that girls face greater emotional vulnerability.
That's a striking gender disparity, Doc. Now, this should reflect something of cultural dynamic or cultural.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, you're correct. This stark gender disparity reflects deeper cultural patterns in Trinidad and Tobago. So it just shows that girls may be targeted more often because usually they're less likely to fight back or even report abuse in the first place. And when we look across all our studies, from Marston's focus on women survivors and Johnson and Wormchild's female case study, there is a clear pattern emerging where we see that females face higher victimization from childhood through adulthood. And this just creates a troubling cycle where early abuse leads to lasting powerlessness, as shown by Marston's findings that adult survivors struggle with relationships and assertiveness. Now, in addition to that, Marston's study of childhood sexual abuse survivors supports this pattern as well, because she found that women who experience abuse as children have significant emotional difficulties as adults. They tend to struggle with trust and emotional withdrawal and just have problems with standing up for themselves. So this actually shows us that childhood abuse doesn't just hurt the child in the moment, but it actually creates long-lasting emotional damage that they take with them into adulthood. And Motley's research adds another significant finding where we see children exposed to parental trauma develop things like anxiety and depression. So these emotional effects have permanent consequences. They create lasting patterns that impact the way children see themselves and their world. And we commonly see patterns of emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and deep distrust as a response to abuse normally. Now, these emotional wounds also show up behaviorally. Johnson and Wormchild documented behavioral problems such as aggression and withdrawal in their survival. And what we really need to understand is that these aren't just random responses. They are actually coping mechanisms that children ultimately develop to deal with their trauma. Descartes' research showed that multiple forms of abuse make behavioral problems worse. So when children experience multiple forms of abuse at once, which their data actually revealed was very common, then behavioral responses tend to multiply. And what we see is increased aggression in children, just really trying their best to regain some semblance of control. We see them withdrawing to protect themselves, and they tend to just process overwhelming experiences with emotional outbursts. Now, Motley's research adds another important finding too, where we see when parents have experienced trauma themselves, it actually affects how they parent their own children. And this parenting creates even more behavioral problems for children already trying to juggle their own trauma.
But Doc, sorry to interject. Now, while the effects of child abuse are undoubtedly damaging, was there any research that showed the sense of hope or that offered that sense of resilience?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because there was a silver lining that I found, especially in the Johnson and Wormchild study. They actually found despite severe trauma, children still show determination to continue their education and help others. So it just tells us that the behavioral responses aren't all negative. They include both harmful and helpful coping mechanisms. Now, when we look across all 4 Trinidad and Tobago studies, we see repeating patterns emerging. What our shared research shows is that emotional and behavioral impacts are 2 sides of the same coin. So we have cognitive behavioral therapy that is shown to work well according to Johnson and Wormchild because it helps children understand how their feelings affect their actions and how their actions affect their feelings. But lastly, what I really wanted to highlight, most importantly, is that our research reveals serious problems in our system that allow these cycles to continue. Descartes and colleagues found that only 3% of reported cases get full psychological evaluations. So this ultimately means that most children never get help to address their emotional pain and their behavioral problems. So we need treatment plans that understand both emotional and behavioral problems as connected parts of trauma that need to be addressed together.
Well said, Doc. Dr. Lafiesha, I see you got to speak. Do you wish to add some information on the other two themes that you explored and examined?
Thank you, Dr. Calim. That was very insightful, Dr. Shikeira. Now, building on Dr. Shikeira's findings, I would like to examine how these emotional and behavioral impacts extend beyond the individual child to affect their capacity for healthy relationships and explore the critical role of parental trauma in executing these patterns across generations. Now, the 4 articles collectively underscore the lasting effects of child abuse and parental trauma on interpersonal development. Now, the analysis highlights how each article contributes to understanding these themes within the context of child abuse and neglect in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, all 4 studies that was used recognize that childhood abuse, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional or sexual, often results in interpersonal difficulties such as emotional detachment, mistrust, social withdrawal, and instability. Now, McPherson places a strong emphasis on adult women survivors of childhood sexual abuse. The study shows that women who were abused, especially by family members, close relatives, they face heightened relationship challenges such as intimacy issues, mistrust, and emotional numbness. Likewise, Descartes' study also notes that children who experience multiple forms of abuse often exhibit relational dysfunction compounded by emotional suppression and aggression. Johnson and Warmchild's study also identified poor caregiver bonding and social interaction difficulties among abused children, while Motley's study highlights how disrupted parent-to-child relationships due to parental trauma can stunt children's social and emotional development.
Now, Dr. Lafiesha, what the literature reveals concerning the role of parental trauma in perpetuating the cycles of child abuse?
All right, doctor. Now, this brings us to the intergenerational trauma transmission cycle. Motley presents the most direct analysis, demonstrating how unaddressed parental trauma leads to harsh parenting and emotional neglect, creating intergenerational harm patterns. When parents have unresolved trauma from their past, lack of protective systems, or they maybe have experienced some sort of familial sexual abuse patterns, or maybe when the guardian failed to protect, this creates a sort of a gap in the system for support. Now, these disrupted parent-to-child relationships, as you can see, often result in stunted social development, emotional difficulties in children, and there's a risk of this cycle going on and on. Now, Johnson and Warmchild's study highlights that many parents perpetuate cycles of abuse due to their own unresolved trauma, and this was also seen in the study by Descartes et al. Also. Now, McPherson's study implies that this dynamic, through the prevalence of familial sexual abuse and the failure of guardians to protect. Now, doctors, if we take all of these studies together, we take all of these studies into consideration, we can see that the consequences of abuse, it is not only a consequences of individual factors, but it's also systematic factors that is rooted in family and societal patterns, which requires a trauma-informed intervention and policy reform, because we need to break this cycle.
Indeed. Now, having reviewed the available literature, several key patterns emerge. Across all 4 studies, there was one central theme: child abuse, in all forms, leaving lasting scars, whether emotional, behavioral, or psychological. And these scars manifest themselves in depression, anxiety, and even in some cases, substance abuse.
Yeah, and what's really crucial to remember, doctor, is that our research shows that these aren't just individual scars. They're systematic scars that affect entire communities when 90%, 97% of children never receive proper psychological evaluation.
Absolutely. The qualitative case shed light on children's internalized fears. The quantitative article revealed high correlation between childhood abuse and mental health disorders. And similarly, the mixed method article shows that caregivers' trauma and mental health significantly shape child outcomes, especially in environments of domestic violence and economic stress.
That is so true. And these impacts, they don't just end in childhood stage. It's like a cycle, and they follow survivors into adulthood, creating long-lasting interpersonal relationship difficulties that keep going on and on and on.
Precisely, long-term relational consequences, right? Now, but going forward, these key recommendations is key. They are very key. Expand community-based mental health services, mandatory reporting and follow mechanism, and school-based preventive programs, right? The study reviewed whether through statistics, case studies, combined approaches, there is a call for a unified response. And there is a dire need for us as scholars, us as citizens, us as policymakers to advocate for prevention. And we must act now. Ladies and gents, this brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Stay curious, stay committed. Thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Dr. Calim Francois. Until next time.